Hello, everyone. Good morning, or afternoon, or evening, depending on where you are and when you watch this. So, today we're going to talk about the SAT and ACT, both tests, the knowledge and skills you need for both of them. So, that might sound a little repetitive, knowledge and skills, but it's actually not. So, first, we're just going to touch briefly on what type of subjects from school that you've probably learned in math class, English class, um, will appear on the SAT and ACT. Then, what we're going to discuss that you will find most useful and is probably most important to know are the skill sets you have to have that you may not get from school. So there's some misconceptions about the SAT and ACT. Some people feel like if you're doing well in school, you'll naturally do well on the SAT and ACT. Now, while that's often true, it's not always true because there are certain things personal to each test that are different from school. On the flip side, I have people who think that school doesn't really matter for the SAT and ACT, that it's its own beast. But that's not really true either. There is a lot from school that you do need to have kind of remember in order to master both of these tests. So we're going to talk a little bit about both areas so you know what to brush up on and what you may really need to invest some time into that you might not have considered beforehand. So knowledge is knowing about specific subjects that will appear on the SAT and ACT. Skills are strategies to beat the test at their own game. Both are necessary to do well. They're both equally important. So you need about 50% knowledge, 50% skills. And that's how you tend to do well on the SAT and ACT. I will often tell my students, and this is true, half the battle of the SAT and ACT is just knowing the test ahead of time, knowing its preferences. We'll talk about those in a little bit. But first, let's talk about knowledge. So knowledge on the SAT. For the reading section, it goes from what you would expect in a newspaper, like an essay you might find in the op-ed section, to some passages that are a fair bit more challenging, to what you would expect in an AP class. So SAT reading has a wider range. It has stuff you might be able to read in school as a ninth grader or so, newspaper level. And then you have stuff that would appear in your like AP history class from the 17 or 1800s, which can be really challenging. So the expectation of what you've learned in school there for the reading is pretty broad. And while we'll say the easier end is not bad at all, the difficulty level it goes up to on the reading can be quite challenging, similar to what you would expect to find in an AP class. For those of you in AP history, you'll actually probably recognize some of the passages when you go through practice SATs. For those of you who are sophomores thinking about what to do next year, this is where an AP class can come in handy. For the grammar on the SAT, you would want to know subject-verb agreement, punctuation, parallelism, tense, redundancy, proper pronoun usage, coherent argument. Now these are skills, this is knowledge you should have learned in your English classes. However, I have had many students tell me that they feel that their English classes don't adequately cover grammar. So this may end up being something you'll need to learn outside of school. With a lot of the students I work with that I tutor, we end up spending a fair bit of time on grammar because the rules are very consistent, which makes it a great area to improve in. But a lot of times students, unfortunately, didn't get taught them in school. But that's not always the case. I also have many students who were taught great grammar skills in school. But that's knowledge that students need to have for the test that they don't always have. The math section. Heavy emphasis on Algebra 2 trig. So the very basics of trig do appear on the SAT, not much further than the old SOHCAHTOA. So that's about as high as the math goes. It has occasional geometry questions. It's not a ton of geometry. The emphasis is more on algebraic functions and light trig. So coordinate geometry is on there, But in terms of geometry, as in dealing with shapes and angles, you get a couple of questions, but not too many. Their emphasis is definitely on algebraic functions, system of equations, and basics of trig. You do need to have non-calculator skills, right? So we'll talk about that in a little bit when we get to the skills section. But some of you, non-calculator is actually something you've learned in school. Depending on the math class you've taken, you might find that you have no choice because the teacher doesn't allow you to use a calculator. While that might be annoying, it would actually really help prepare you for the SAT. So, knowledge on the ACT. The good news, the grammar section is near identical to the SAT. So all the grammar we discussed before, that's the knowledge you would need on the SAT. The math knowledge on the SAT is much broader than the math knowledge on the ACT is much broader than the math knowledge on the SAT. The questions go up to the same difficulty level as the SAT, talking about Algebra 2 trig. But the ACT includes a lot more geometry. A lot more geometry. And it even includes math that goes back as far as 8th and 9th grade, extensive use of proportions, for instance. That sounds kind of great because it's like, oh, now I don't, 8th, 9th grade math, that's nice and simple. It might be, but it also might be stuff you've forgotten. So there's a lot you've learned in school about math that appears on the ACT, but because it's over so many years, some students do find that a little tricky. Your reading knowledge for the ACT, much simpler than that of the SAT. The passages have a very moderate difficulty level. Most early high school students would have no problem reading it. That doesn't mean the reading section is simple, just that the knowledge for the reading section is a little bit more basic than the SAT's reading section. But there's a catch to this that we'll discuss in a minute that makes the reading on the ACT its own challenge. For science, little to no science knowledge is needed. So unfortunately, your science classes in school aren't radically helpful. That doesn't mean nothing from them will ever come up, but it's pretty rare that any sort of knowledge from school is going to make too much of a difference. So the science section is where school knowledge really doesn't play much of a part. It's really all about interpretation skills, which we'll talk about in a moment as we go through the skills section. So skills on the SAT. This is the type of stuff that you're not going to be taught in school. This is the type of stuff that I have to tell my students that they've never really considered before. And while by no means do I have the time to tell you guys all the skills on the test, I can give you at least an overview of what you have to start thinking about. If we had maybe 10 hours, we could discuss all the skills you would need. But I will discuss kind of some of the overall ideas. For instance, I'll often tell my students that for the SAT reading, you need to see the forest from the trees. A good skill to learn is how to read passages that are difficult and still understand the main purpose. In other words, you have to get through sentences you might not understand and be comfortable with that while still getting the main purpose of the passage. A lot of that comes from knowing where to look in a passage and when you can kind of skim over, not too worried if those sentences are confusing or cluttered. It's about understanding a purpose and where to find that in a passage. Skills for the grammar section come down to language preferences. The SAT has a particular approach to language that it likes, short and to the point. Now, you might feel that a longer sentence better expresses a thought, but the SAT won't agree. And this is where some of my students kind of complain and are like, it's not fair. And I'm at least a little sympathetic to that idea. The SAT has a certain type of writing style that they prefer to see. So when you're in the grammar section and they're asking about the best ways to form a sentence or form a paragraph, a good skill to know is, how does the SAT like their writing to appear? And one of the specifications is they like things short and to the point. There are many others too, but that's an example of one takeaway. Mental math skills are very important. Mental math is not something you're doing a ton of in school. Mental math skills is something you have to practice more for specifically the SAT, because there's a whole section without a calculator. So your mental math skills are important, as is knowing when to use those skills and when to actually write out the math by hand. So you have to let the question guide whether you'll do it mentally or write it out. This comes down to both being accurate and mastering your time. One of the great skills for the SAT is knowing common answers that the test likes. A lot of times, especially in the quote-unquote fill-in section, that's where you have questions without multiple choice. You just have to put down an answer. They have a lot of numbers that they like to see as answers. Sometimes I can sort of predict what the number will be. I'll give a slight slip and say that they like the number 2 in that section. And I often see the number 2 as an answer. That's not knowledge, right? That's just a skill set, something that you notice specifically for the SAT. Skills for the ACT are often quite similar. Once again, for the grammar section, you have to know what the test likes and doesn't like. For the ACT, for instance, they hate the word being. So if that's in a choice, it's usually a bad one. That's not really knowledge, it's more of a knowing how the test works. In the math section, you have to be able to spot questions where the answer is best solved by plugging in the answer choices. This saves time and makes questions easier. But again, that's not something you would know from school. That's something that comes from practice or mentorship as people guide you through what type of questions those are. And I can't stress enough that practicing these tests makes a huge difference, because you're going to pick up those skills, as opposed to just walking in and being like, I did well in school, so I'm sure the test will be fine. For reading, you need to know ahead of time what the passage will be asking about, such as the purpose of the passage, so that you know what to look for instead of getting bogged down in a tightly timed section. Earlier I mentioned that the reading section is a little gentler than the SATs in terms of the content, right? What you have to read. And that's absolutely true. The problem is the timing is a lot tighter than the SAT. So you have to have a lot of skills to manage that. So whereas an AP English class is definitely going to help on the SAT, for the ACT, it's more about working to master your timing skills. Sitting down, figuring out different timing approaches. The science section, as I alluded to earlier, is the section where skills come in the most. This is the section where practice makes perfect more than any other section. Because, simply put, what you learn in school isn't hugely impactful here. It's its own section. Now, some students love this section because it's so skills-based that they kind of have fun mastering it. Others don't like it because they feel like this isn't something I'm used to seeing, so they feel a little scared. So you have to have excellent interpretive skills for the science section. It's a section based on graphs, and you need to know how they're going to trip you up with image-based information. For instance, they like to present 2 graphs that look like they're measuring the same thing, but sometimes they'll change the amounts on the axis. So that's one of those things that's a skill that you're not learning in school that you do need to know for the SAT and ACT. So the SAT and ACT really are 50-50. 50% is the knowledge that you learn in your subjects in school. Can't stress it enough. Those are very important. But the other 50% are the tips and tricks the skills, knowing the test preferences, and that comes from practice. And I mentioned some of them, but as I said, there are so many small tips and tricks, so many skills that you'll need to master that it takes time. And the good thing is, since the tests have been slightly delayed until June, you now have the time to master those skills, as opposed to kind of cramming beforehand. So special offer here for our online self-paced program, which is an extremely useful tool that goes through different types of questions, different approaches. It gives you explanations to questions, which is very, very helpful. I highly recommend using it. It's very useful now since you're all at home. So you can definitely give it a try. We also have SAT and ACT classes for all situations. We have, for instance, I am running an SAT class on Mondays and Wednesdays from 4 to 6, which just started last Wednesday. So if you want to join, you still can, and we'll send you the recording of the first class. But we have multiple times and days for SAT and ACT classes, and multiple subjects too. So if you're only interested in, say, the reading part of the ACT, we have a class specially designed for that. In addition, we have online tutoring for the SAT and ACT. I tutor both of those subjects, as do my esteemed colleagues. But while we have been talking about SAT and ACT, certainly for college admissions, that's half the battle, but your GPA and subjects in school are also important. And we offer tutoring in basically all the school subjects. If you're learning Latin, you might be out of luck, but otherwise you're covered with us for your school subjects. And I put a link down there as to where you can go to find our online tutoring. So thank you for joining me to discuss the skills and knowledge you'll need to learn on the SAT and ACT. This was just a brief overview, but it should give you an idea of what you're expected to know and what type of skills you're going to want to make sure you pick up on your own outside of school. All right, I wish you all a good day. Stay safe and remember to wash your hands. Have a great day.